The audience gasped as Charlotte James, seven-time Grammy winner and country music royalty, brought him onto the stage. His weathered hands trembled as he gripped the microphone. The same hands that had guided her paintbrush just weeks before. "This man," Charlotte announced to the crowd of 20,000, "taught me more about life in 3 days than fame taught me in 10 years. The spotlight hit his sun-bronzed face as tears welled in his eyes. Nobody in his hometown would believe that the broken-down farmer who couldn't even afford to fix his tractor was now standing on stage with America's most beloved country star. But as Charlotte began strumming the opening chords to "Fated Fences," a song clearly about him, he realized some connections transcend all boundaries, even those between different worlds. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The summer heat pressed down on Cedar Creek like a heavy blanket, the kind that suffocates rather than comforts. Mason Bradley wiped sweat from his brow with a forearm equally damp, leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead. The white fence surrounding his modest farmhouse hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in at least a decade. Once pristine, it now stood weathered and gray, a visual testament to his mounting financial troubles. At 42, Mason wasn't where he'd imagined he'd be. The small 20-acre farm he'd inherited from his father was barely keeping afloat. 3 consecutive seasons of drought had ravaged his crops. The bank had already sent 2 foreclosure warnings. His shoulders sagged under the weight of it all as he stirred the half-empty can of white paint with a stick he'd found in the yard. "Might as well make the place look decent before they take it," he muttered to no one. His loyal border collie, Rusty, lounged in the sparse shade of a nearby oak tree, panting in the relentless heat. The rumble of an approaching vehicle caught his attention. Through the shimmering heat waves rising from the dusty road, Mason spotted a sleek black SUV slowing down. The vehicle seemed comically out of place on the rural road where most folks drove pickup trucks held together by rust and prayers. The SUV pulled to a stop, and Mason straightened his back, curiosity momentarily overriding his fatigue. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out, her face obscured by oversized sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat. She wore simple jeans and a loose white button-down shirt, but even from a distance, Mason could tell the casual outfit probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget. "Excuse me," she called out, approaching the fence line with a hesitant wave. "Is this Cedar Creek Road?" Mason nodded, resting his paintbrush against the can. "Yes, ma'am. You're about 5 miles from town." The woman removed her sunglasses, revealing striking hazel eyes that seemed to shift color in the sunlight. "Oh, thank goodness. My GPS went haywire about 20 minutes back." Something about her seemed vaguely familiar to Mason, but he couldn't place it. She had the kind of face that made you feel like you'd seen her somewhere before, perhaps in a magazine or on television. "You headed into town?" he asked, wiping his hands on his already stained jeans. "Actually," she said, her eyes drifting to the peeling fence, "I'm just taking a drive, getting away for a bit." She paused, studying the partially painted section. "That looks like quite a job for one person." Mason chuckled dryly. "Yep, got about a quarter-mile of fence and only me to paint it. But it's not like I've got much else to do these days." The admission slipped out before he could catch himself, a rare moment of vulnerability he typically kept hidden. The woman stepped closer to the fence, running her fingers along the rough wood. "I used to help my granddad paint his barn every summer. Therapeutic, in a way." "Well, therapeutic isn't exactly the word I'd use right now," Mason replied, glancing at the blisters already forming on his palms. To his surprise, the woman laughed a genuine melodic sound that seemed to brighten the oppressive summer day. "You know what? I've got nowhere to be. How about I help you?" Mason blinked, certain he'd misheard. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I insist," she said, already rolling up her sleeves. "I'm Kate, by the way." "Mason Bradley," he replied automatically, still processing the bizarre turn of events. "But really, you don't have to." "I want to," Kate said firmly. "Besides, I could use some sun." She gestured to her arms, which were indeed rather pale, despite the summer season. Mason hesitated. Pride told him to refuse. He didn't need charity, especially not from a clearly well-off stranger. But pragmatism reminded him of the mountain of work ahead, and his aching back. "Well, if you're sure," he finally conceded, reaching for a spare brush he'd brought out that morning. "Though I should warn you, it's not exactly glamorous work." Kate smiled, taking the brush from him with surprising eagerness. "Trust me, I could use a break from glamour." Something in her tone made Mason glance at her more carefully, but she had already dipped her brush into the paint and was applying smooth, even strokes to the fence. For someone who looked like she'd never done a day of manual labor, her technique was remarkably proficient. "You weren't kidding about painting with your granddad," he observed, impressed despite himself. A shadow of something nostalgia, perhaps, or sadness crossed her face briefly. "Some of my best memories," she said softly. Then, as if catching herself, she brightened. "So, Mason Bradley of Cedar Creek Road, what's your story?" Mason resumed his own painting, keeping pace with her as they worked side by side. "Not much to tell. Born and raised right here. Took over the farm when my dad passed 10 years ago. It's just me and Rusty these days." He nodded toward the dog, who had lifted his head at the sound of his name. "No Mrs. Bradley?" Kate asked, her focus seemingly on the fence. "There was, briefly. Angela left 8 years ago, said farm life wasn't what she signed up for." He wasn't sure why he was sharing this with a stranger, but something about Kate's presence made it easy to talk. Kate nodded thoughtfully. "Her loss," she said simply, and Mason felt an unexpected warmth at the straightforward comment. "What about you?" he asked, changing the subject. "Just passing through?" Kate seemed to consider her answer carefully. "Something like that. I needed some time away from work. It gets overwhelming sometimes." "What kind of work has you driving around back roads in the middle of nowhere?" She smiled enigmatically. "The kind that doesn't leave much room for painting fences or watching sunsets." They fell into a comfortable rhythm, painting side by side as the morning stretched toward noon. Mason found himself relaxing in Kate's company. She was easy to talk to, asking questions about the farm and local area with genuine interest, never pushing when he gave short answers about his financial struggles. By midday, they had covered a significant section of fence, and the heat had become nearly unbearable. Mason dropped his brush into the paint can and straightened, his back protesting the movement. "We should take a break," he said, noticing the flush in Kate's cheeks. "Got some lemonade inside if you'd like." Kate wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of white paint above her eyebrow. "Lemonade sounds heavenly." As they walked toward the house, Rusty finally decided the newcomer was worth investigating. He approached Kate cautiously, sniffing at her paint-spattered hand. "Hello there," she said softly, crouching down to the dog's level. She let him sniff her thoroughly before gently scratching behind his ears. To Mason's surprise, Rusty immediately leaned into her touch, his usual wariness around strangers nowhere to be seen. "Well, I'll be," Mason commented. "Old Rusty here usually takes days to warm up to folks." Kate looked up, still petting the now ecstatic dog. "I've always had a way with animals. They don't care who you are or what you do, just how you treat them." There was something in her words of wistfulness, perhaps that struck Mason as odd, but he brushed it aside as they entered the farmhouse. The interior was modest, but clean, with worn furniture that spoke of years of use rather than neglect. Mason gestured for Kate to sit at the small kitchen table, while he retrieved a pitcher of lemonade from the refrigerator. "Hope you don't mind it on the tart side," he said, pouring 2 glasses. "Never did care for things too sweet." "Perfect," Kate replied after taking a sip. "My grandmother made it the same way." Mason settled into the chair across from her, studying his unexpected helper. Up close, in the dimmer light of the kitchen, that sense of familiarity grew stronger. Her features were delicate, yet strong, with high cheekbones and an expressive mouth, currently quirked in a half-smile as she caught him staring. "Something on my face?" she asked. "Paint, actually," Mason answered, tapping his own eyebrow to indicate the spot on hers. Kate laughed and tried to wipe it away, only managing to smear it further. The sight this polished woman with designer sunglasses sitting in his humble kitchen with paint on her face struck Mason as absurdly funny. Before he could stop himself, he was laughing, really laughing, for what felt like the first time in years. Kate joined in, her earlier composure dissolving into giggles as she made another failed attempt at removing the paint. "That bad, huh?" "Here," Mason said, still chuckling as he dampened a paper towel and handed it to her. "You're making it worse." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Mason felt an unexpected jolt at the contact. Kate seemed to feel it too, her laughter subsiding as their eyes met briefly. She quickly looked away, focusing intently on cleaning the paint from her face. An awkward silence settled between them, broken only when Mason cleared his throat and stood to refill their glasses. "So, you never did say where you're from?" he prompted, eager to dispel the sudden tension. Kate seemed relieved by the change in subject. "Nashville originally, but I travel so much for work that home is a pretty flexible concept these days." "Nashville, huh? Music business?" It was an obvious guess. The city was synonymous with country music. A flash of alarm crossed Kate's face before she composed herself. "Something like that," she said vaguely. "What about you? Always been a farmer?" Mason allowed the deflection, sensing her discomfort. "Born and raised to it. Though I did have dreams of playing baseball professionally once upon a time." He gestured to a framed newspaper clipping hanging on the wall, showing a much younger version of himself mid-pitch, wearing a high school uniform. Kate rose to examine the photo more closely. "Cedar Creek High's star pitcher leads team to state championships," she read aloud. "Impressive. What happened?" "Life," Mason said simply. "Dad got sick my senior year. College scholarships didn't cover enough, and someone had to run the farm." He shrugged, having long ago made peace with the path not taken. "No regrets, though. Dad lived another 15 years, and those were good years." Kate nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Still, it couldn't have been easy, giving up that dream." "Most dreams need adjusting along the way," Mason replied. "I suspect you know something about that yourself." Something in his words seemed to resonate with her. She turned from the photo, her expression suddenly vulnerable. "Sometimes I wonder if I adjusted too much, if the dream I ended up with is still mine at all." The raw honesty in her voice caught Mason off guard. Before he could respond, the ring of a cell phone shattered the moment. Kate jumped, fishing an expensive-looking smartphone from her pocket. She glanced at the screen and her entire demeanor changed, shoulders tensing, jaw tightening. "I need to take this," she said apologetically, already moving toward the door. "Just give me a minute." Mason watched through the window as she paced in the yard, gesturing animatedly during what appeared to be an intense conversation. Even from a distance, he could see the transformation in her body language. Gone was the relaxed woman who had painted beside him all morning, replaced by someone who radiated tension and authority. When Kate returned several minutes later, some of that tension lingered around her eyes, though she attempted a smile. "I'm so sorry, but I need to go. Work emergency." "Everything okay?" Mason asked, genuinely concerned. "Nothing serious, just complicated." She glanced at her paint-stained hands and clothes. "Thank you for the lemonade, and for letting a stranger help paint your fence." Mason followed her outside, oddly disappointed by her sudden departure. "I should be thanking you. You didn't have to stop, let alone help." Kate paused by her SUV, looking back at the partially painted fence with unmistakable longing. "Honestly, this is the most normal I've felt in years." She reached into her purse and withdrew a business card, handing it to him. "If you ever need anything, or just want to talk." Mason glanced down at the card. It was plain white, with only a phone number printed in elegant script. No name, no company logo. When he looked up, Kate was already sliding into the driver's seat. "Will you come back?" The question surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Kate's expression softened. "I'd like to. Maybe to see the finished fence." With a final smile and a wave, she drove away, leaving Mason standing in a cloud of dust, the mysterious card still in his hand. It wasn't until later that evening, as Mason sat on his porch with a cold beer, that the nagging sense of familiarity finally clicked. He nearly choked on his drink As realization dawned, rushing inside, he opened his laptop, a dinosaur of a machine that groaned to life with painful slowness. A quick search confirmed his suspicion. There she was, the same hazel eyes, the same delicate features, though usually framed by cascading blonde waves rather than tucked under a sun hat. Charlotte James, country music superstar, 7-time Grammy winner, currently on a break from her sold-out national tour. Mason slumped back in his chair, stunned. Charlotte James had spent the morning painting his fence. Charlotte James had sat at his kitchen table, drinking his homemade lemonade. Charlotte James, whose music occasionally played on the ancient radio in his tractor, whose face adorned billboards and magazine covers, had handed him her personal phone number. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered to Rusty, who cocked his head in canine curiosity. "No wonder she was so good at painting. Probably has people to paint her mansion fences all the time." He stared at the business card, turning it over in his fingers thoughtfully. Part of him wanted to call the number immediately, just to confirm he hadn't imagined the whole bizarre encounter. But what would he say? "Hi, I know you're actually Charlotte James, and by the way, I'm a struggling farmer about to lose everything." With a sigh, Mason placed the card on his bedside table. Famous country stars didn't return to paint fences with nobodies like him. Tomorrow, the encounter would feel like a strange dream, and life would return to its mundane struggle. Yet, as he drifted off to sleep that night, Mason couldn't help but hope that Charlotte might keep her word and return. The next morning dawned just as hot, the painted portion of the fence gleaming white in the harsh sunlight, a stark contrast to the weathered gray sections still awaiting attention. Mason ran his fingers along the neat brush strokes Kate had applied, still processing the reality of who had helped him. His phone rang, startling him from his reverie. The bank. With a heavy sigh, Mason answered, already knowing what was coming. "Mr. Bradley," the stern voice of his loan officer began, "I'm calling about your outstanding payments." The conversation went exactly as expected. Final warnings, deadlines, sympathetic platitudes followed by firm reminders of financial reality. By the time Mason hung up, the weight on his shoulders felt doubled. 30 days, he told Rusty, who had followed him outside. Then it's all gone. The dog whined softly, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. Mason scratched behind his ears absently, his gaze fixed on the distant fields. The corn was struggling, stunted by drought and lack of proper fertilizer he couldn't afford. Without a miracle harvest, there was no way to meet the bank's demands. With mechanical determination, Mason picked up his paintbrush. The fence wouldn't save the farm, but finishing the job would at least give him something to control in a situation spiraling beyond his grasp. Hours passed, the sun climbing mercilessly higher. Around noon, the rumble of an approaching vehicle broke the silence. Mason straightened, paint dripping from his brush, as hope flared briefly. Could it be her? The disappointment was swift when he recognized the beat-up truck belonging to his neighbor, Frank Wilson. The older man climbed out, his weathered face creased with concern. "Heard about the bank notice," Frank said without preamble. In small towns like Cedar Creek, news traveled faster than internet connections. Mason nodded grimly. 30 days. Frank leaned against the fence, careful to avoid the fresh paint. "Listen, son. I know it's not my place, but have you considered selling some of the land? Keep the house, let go of the fields? And do what, Frank? Farming's all I know." Mason dipped his brush with more force than necessary, splattering white droplets across the dusty ground. "There's that new factory over in Millfield. They're hiring. Pays decent, benefits too." Mason remained silent, the suggestion landing like a stone in his stomach. Taking a factory job would mean admitting defeat, conceding that 5 generations of Bradley farmers ended with him. Frank seemed to sense his turmoil. "Just think about it," he said gently. "No shame in changing course when the river runs dry." With a supportive clap on Mason's shoulder, the older man returned to his truck. Alone again, Mason worked mechanically until his stomach reminded him he'd skipped breakfast. Inside the kitchen, he made a simple sandwich and found himself staring at Charlotte's business card, still sitting where he'd left it the night before. On impulse, he picked it up and dialed the number, half expecting to reach a secretary or manager. To his shock, she answered on the third ring. "Hello?" Her voice was cautious, guarded. Hi," Mason stuttered, suddenly feeling foolish. "It's Mason. From yesterday? The fence?" There was a moment of silence, then her tone warmed considerably. "Mason, I didn't expect to hear from you so soon." "Yeah, well," he trailed off, realizing he had no real reason for calling. "Just wanted to say thanks again for the help. The part we did looks great." "I'm glad," she replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "How much do you have left to go?" Mason glanced out the window at the expanse of unpainted fence. "About 3/4 of it. My neighbor stopped by today. Distracted me for a bit." Something in his tone must have conveyed his mood, because Charlotte asked, "Everything okay?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly undid him. Mason found himself sinking into a chair, suddenly overwhelmed by the urge to confide in this virtual stranger who happened to be a celebrity. "Not really," he admitted. "Bank called. I've got 30 days to come up with payments I can't make, or I lose the farm." He immediately regretted the admission. "Sorry, I shouldn't dump that on you. You've got your own—" "Don't apologize," Charlotte interrupted firmly. "I asked because I wanted to know." A pause, then, "Would it help if I came back tomorrow? To paint, I mean. I have a free day before I need to be in, before my next work commitment." Mason was stunned by the offer. "You'd do that? Don't you have, I don't know, glamorous celebrity things to do?" The words slipped out before he could stop them. The line went silent, and Mason closed his eyes, cursing inwardly. Of course he'd recognized her. How could he not? "So you figured it out?" she finally said, her voice carefully neutral. "Last night," he confirmed. "I'm not going to tell anyone, if that's what you're worried about." Charlotte sighed. "It's not that. Well, not just that. It's—" She seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "When I'm Charlotte James, people see what they want to see. When I was just Kate yesterday, you saw me. The real me." The vulnerability in her confession struck Mason deeply. "For what it's worth, I liked Kate. Still do. I liked being her," Charlotte replied softly. "So, the fence? Tomorrow? Unless you're uncomfortable now that you know." "The fence will still be here," Mason said, surprised by how much he wanted to see her again. "And so will I." They agreed on a time, and Mason hung up feeling strangely lighter despite his dire circumstances. Charlotte James was coming back to his farm, voluntarily, to pay defense. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. The next morning, Mason was up before dawn, an old habit from years of farm work. He made some minor repairs to particularly damaged fence sections, swept the porch, and even changed into a somewhat cleaner shirt. All the while, he tried to ignore the voice in his head, asking what exactly he thought he was doing, preparing for a country music superstar, as if she were coming for dinner rather than charity fence painting. She arrived precisely when promised. This time, in a more modest rental car, rather than the flashy SUV. As she stepped out, Mason was struck again by her ability to blend in wearing simple jeans, a plaid shirt, and a baseball cap with her hair tucked up inside it. Only her oversized sunglasses hinted at a desire for anonymity. "Nice disguise," he commented as she approached, carrying 2 large coffee cups. Charlotte grinned, handing him one of the cups. "Years of practice. Black with 1 sugar, right? You mentioned it yesterday." Mason was touched. She'd remembered such a small detail. "Perfect. Thanks." He took a sip, appreciating both the gesture and the quality of what was clearly not gas station coffee. They settled into work with surprising ease, picking up where they'd left off. The awkwardness Mason had feared after revealing he knew her identity never materialized. Instead, their conversation flowed even more freely. With Charlotte, she'd insisted he still call her Kate when they were alone sharing stories about life on tour and the realities behind the glamorous facade. "The worst part is never being alone, but always being lonely," she confided as they worked side by side. "I'm surrounded by people constantly, managers, band members, security, fans. But there's always this invisible wall. Everyone wants something, even if it's just a piece of Charlotte James to take home. Mason considered this as he refreshed his paintbrush. Sounds exhausting. It is. That's why I snapped yesterday when I had the chance to be anonymous for a while, to do something simple and physical and real. She gestured at the fence with her brush. This is real. Conversations without agendas are real. Is that why you came back today? Mason asked, curiosity getting the better of him. Charlotte paused, her brush hovering over the wood. Partly, she admitted, but also because I was worried about you. What you said about the bank. Is it really that bad? Mason's instinct was to deflect, to minimize as he always did. But something about Charlotte's direct gaze broke through his usual reserve. Yeah, it's that bad. Drought hit us hard 3 years running. Equipment repairs, seed costs, medical bills when I broke my leg last winter. It all piled up. He shrugged, trying to seem more resigned than devastated. Been fighting it for years, but I'm out of options. Unless I can come up with $40,000 in the next month, the Bradley family farm ends with me. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. What if you're about to offer me money? Mason interrupted firmly. Please don't. I didn't tell you that to get a handout. She looked startled, then slightly embarrassed. Is it that obvious what I was thinking? Let's just say you wouldn't be the first rich person to think throwing money at a problem fixes it, Mason replied, then immediately regretted his sharp tone. Sorry. That came out wrong. But Charlotte shook her head. No, you're right. It was presumptuous. She resumed painting, her strokes more deliberate now. For what it's worth, I admire that. Your pride, I mean. Lots of people wouldn't hesitate to take advantage if they knew who I was. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of their brushstrokes creating a soothing backdrop. By midday, they had made significant progress, with over half the fence now gleaming white in the sunlight. Break time, Mason announced, noticing Charlotte's slowing pace and the flush in her cheeks. You're not used to this heat. I'm fine, she protested, but the relief on her face when Mason took her brush was unmistakable. They retreated to the shade of the large oak tree, where Mason had prepared a simple picnic sandwiches, chips, and cold sweet tea in mason jars. Rusty joined them, settling at Charlotte's feet with obvious adoration. You've bewitched my dog, Mason observed as Charlotte slipped the animal a piece of her sandwich. It's my superpower, she replied with a grin. Dogs and children see through the celebrity nonsense. They just respond to energy. And what about fence-painting farmers? What do we respond to? The question came out more flirtatious than Mason had intended, and he saw Charlotte's eyes widen slightly. She recovered quickly, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Authenticity, I think. And maybe lemonade. The moment lingered between them, charged with something neither seemed ready to name. Mason found himself studying her, features the light dusting of freckles across her nose, nearly invisible beneath makeup on album covers, but prominent now in the natural light, the tiny scar above her left eyebrow, the way her eyes crinkled genuinely when she smiled, unlike the practiced pose she struck for cameras. Charlotte cleared her throat, breaking the spell. Tell me about the farm. What's it like when things are good? Grateful for the change in subject, Mason painted a verbal picture of spring plantings and fall harvests, of the satisfaction of working land his great-grandfather had tilled. He described the rhythms of farm life, dawn patrols of the property, midnight emergency repairs during harvest season, the unique joy of watching seeds transform into sustenance. Charlotte listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed her genuine interest. When Mason described the community barn raising after a tornado had destroyed his equipment shed 3 years prior, her eyes grew misty. That's what I miss most, I think, she said softly. Community. Real connections. In my world, relationships are so transactional. Even family? Mason asked. A shadow crossed her face. Especially family, sometimes. My parents became my managers when I was 16. The line between daughter and investment got blurry fast. She pulled a blade of grass, twirling it between her fingers. We don't talk much anymore. Not really talk anyway. The admission clearly cost her. and Mason resisted the urge to press for details. Instead, he shared his own family story: the mother who'd left when he was 12, the father who'd raised him alone, teaching him to farm and to face hardship without bitterness. "He sounds like a remarkable man," Charlotte said when Mason finished. "He would have gotten a kick out of this situation, that's for sure." Mason gestured between them. Famous country singer helping his disaster of a son pay defense. He'd have said God has a sense of humor. "And what do you say?" Charlotte asked, her gaze intent. Mason considered the question seriously. "I'd say life has a way of bringing people together when they both need something they didn't know they were missing." The afternoon continued in this vein, work interspersed with increasingly personal conversations. By the time the sun began its descent, the fence was completely painted, gleaming white against the darkening sky. They stood back to admire their work, covered in paint splatters, but undeniably satisfied. "We make a good team," Charlotte observed, removing her cap to release her hair from its confinement. The golden waves tumbled down, catching the sunset's glow. Mason nodded, suddenly aware that their time together was ending. "We do." Charlotte seemed equally reluctant to leave, lingering as she gathered her few belongings. "I have to go back tomorrow," she said finally. "Tour resumes in Dallas the day after." "I figured," Mason replied, trying to keep disappointment from his voice. "Thanks for this. Not just the fence, but everything." "Will you be okay?" she asked, her concern evident. "With the farm, I mean." Mason shrugged, aiming for nonchalance. "I'll figure something out. Always do." Charlotte bit her lip, clearly wanting to say more, but respecting his boundaries. "I'm not good at goodbyes," she admitted. "Then don't say it," Mason suggested. "Just say you'll let me know when you're passing through again." Her smile was worth the risk of presumption. "I will." "And Mason?" She reached for his hand, her smaller one fitting perfectly in his calloused palm. "Thank you for seeing me. Not Charlotte James, just me." Before he could respond, she stood on tiptoe and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, then quickly turned and walked to her car. Mason watched her drive away, the setting sun casting long shadows across the newly painted fence, a bright line in his life, delineating before and after meeting her. That night, unable to sleep, Mason scrolled through music streaming sites, listening to Charlotte's psalms with new ears. Her latest album, Rhinestones and Reality, took on deeper meaning now that he'd glimpsed the woman behind the persona. The honesty in her lyrics about fame's isolation and the search for authentic connection resonated with their conversations. He found himself returning to one song in particular, Invisible Lines, about the barriers people erect and the courage required to cross them. Was it presumptuous to wonder if their brief connection might have affected her as deeply as it had affected him? The days following Charlotte's departure slipped back into their familiar pattern, though the freshly painted fence served as a constant reminder of the surreal interlude. Mason threw himself into farm work with renewed determination, exploring every possible avenue to save his property. Equipment sales, partial land leases, even Frank's suggested factory job. Applications as a last resort. None of it would be enough, he knew, but surrender wasn't in his nature. A week passed, then two. Charlotte texted occasionally brief messages about her tour, photos of interesting views from hotel windows, questions about how the fence was holding up. Mason responded in kind, carefully avoiding mention of his worsening financial situation. She had her own life, her own concerns. His problems weren't her burden. Then, 3 weeks after her departure, with the bank's deadline looming, Mason received a peculiar call from the mayor of Cedar Creek. "Mason, my boy," Mayor Thompson boomed, his enthusiasm practically vibrating through the phone. "How would you feel about hosting a benefit concert on your property this weekend?" Mason frowned in confusion. "A what now?" "A benefit concert. For drought relief for local farmers. Small affair, maybe 1,000 people. We'll handle all the setup, security, everything. All you need to do is provide the space. That western field of yours that's lying fallow this season would be perfect." "Who's performing at this small affair?" Mason asked suspiciously. The mayor cleared his throat. "Well, now that's the exciting part. Charlotte James herself. Can you believe it? Says she was driving through our area, fell in love with the community, Wants to give back. Specifically requested your farm as the venue. Mason sat down heavily, stunned. She requested my farm? By name? Indeed she did. Said something about it having the perfect rural ambiance for her acoustic set. Now, she's handling most of the expenses herself, but will need volunteers for setup, parking, that sort of thing. The best part is, 70% of proceeds go directly to a fund for farmers facing foreclosure due to the drought. The rest covers minimal expenses. End quote. As the mayor continued detailing the plan, Mason's mind raced. This was Charlotte's solution, not a direct handout he would reject, but a way to help that preserved his dignity, while potentially saving not just his farm but others in similar straits. When would they start setting up? He asked when the mayor finally paused for breath. Tomorrow, if that works for you. Her team is already in town, staying at the Cedar Creek Inn. Small group, very professional. Mason agreed, still processing the implications. As soon as the call ended, he texted Charlotte. A concert? Really? Her response came almost immediately. Surprise? Don't be mad. It's not charity, it's music fans paying for tickets to hear music. You're just providing the scenic backdrop. He couldn't help smiling at her clever maneuvering. Pretty elaborate scheme just to see my fence again. The fence is just a bonus. It's the farmer I'm coming back for. Mason stared at her message, heart racing at the implication. Before he could formulate a response, another text arrived. Is that okay? If you're not comfortable with this, say the word and I'll cancel everything. The fact that she would abandon her plans at his request, despite the logistics already in motion, touched him deeply. No, don't cancel. Just surprised. Thank you for thinking of this. The next morning brought a flurry of activity to the typically quiet Bradley farm. Production trucks rolled in before dawn, followed by sound engineers, stage builders, security personnel, and various other specialists. Mason watched in amazement as his fallow field transformed into a concert venue, complete with a modest stage, sound system, and even portable restroom facilities. Charlotte's tour manager, a no-nonsense woman named Vivian, sought him out early in the process, clipboard in hand and Bluetooth earpiece constantly buzzing with updates. Mr. Bradley, she said briskly, offering a firm handshake. Charlotte speaks very highly of you. She's asked that you have final approval on the setup to ensure we're respecting your property. Mason blinked in surprise. That's thoughtful, but I'm sure you folks know what you're doing better than I do. Vivian's professional demeanor softened slightly. Between you and me, Mr. Bradley, this is the most engaged Charlotte has been in production details in years. Whatever happened during her time here clearly meant something to her. Before Mason could process this revelation, Vivian was all business again, walking him through the plans for parking, crowd control, and post-concert cleanup. By noon, the transformation was well underway, with local volunteers joining the professional crew to help wherever needed. The news had spread like wildfire through Cedar Creek and surrounding communities. A Charlotte James concert not in a major city arena, but right here in farm country, and for such a worthy cause. The local radio station played her hits on repeat, and the small-town newspaper ran a special edition featuring the upcoming event. Charlotte herself arrived the evening before the concert, after most of the setup was complete. Mason was checking irrigation lines in a distant field when Rusty's excited barking alerted him to visitors. He turned to see Charlotte approaching, accompanied by a burly man who maintained a respectful distant security, Mason presumed. She looked different, yet Agonot the disguised Kate of their fence-painting days, nor the glamorous star from album covers, but somewhere in between. Her hair fell in natural waves, and she wore a simple sundress with cowboy boots. The tension that had marked her features during their first meeting was absent, replaced by an almost giddy excitement. "What do you think?" she called out, gesturing toward the transformed field visible in the distance. Too much? Not enough? Mason crossed the distance between them, suddenly aware of his dirty work clothes and sweat-stained hat. "It's amazing," he admitted. "The whole town's buzzing. Mayor Thompson might explode from pride." Charlotte laughed, the sound even more musical than he remembered. "Good! That's exactly what we wanted. "Oh, this is Jim, by the way." She nodded toward the security guard, who acknowledged Mason with a respectful nod. "Ma'am, I'll wait by the car," Jim said, already retreating to give them privacy. When they were alone, Charlotte's professional Polish slipped, revealing the more vulnerable woman Mason had come to know. "I wasn't sure you'd be okay with all this," she admitted, gesturing vaguely at the concert preparations. "It kind of snowballed once my management realized they could get good publicity out of it. Are you okay with it?" Mason countered. "Seems like a lot of trouble to go through just to help some farmers you barely know." Charlotte met his gaze directly. "I know you. That's enough." She paused, then added more softly, "Besides, I meant what I said in my text. The fundraising is important, but seeing you again was the real motivation." The admission hung between them, charged with possibility. Mason took a step closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. "Charlotte, there you are." Vivian's voice cut through the moment as she strode toward them, heels somehow navigating the uneven ground with practiced ease. "Sound check in 20 minutes, and the local press wants a statement about tomorrow's event." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, visibly shifting back into professional mode. "Coming, Viv." To Mason, she said, "Duty calls. But we'll talk later? Maybe after the sound check?" He nodded, trying to hide his disappointment at the interruption. "I'll be around." The sound check stretched into interviews, which led to a planning meeting for the next day's performance. By the time Charlotte was free again, it was nearly midnight. Mason had waited up, sitting on his porch with a bottle of beer, watching the distant lights of the stage area where crew members still made final adjustments. His phone pinged with a text. "Still awake?" "On the porch," he replied simply. Minutes later, Charlotte emerged from the darkness, having apparently slipped away from her entourage. She climbed the porch steps and settled into the rocking chair beside him, exhaling deeply as if releasing the day's tensions. "Beer?" he offered, reaching into the small cooler beside his chair. "God, yes." She accepted gratefully, taking a long sip. "Sorry about earlier. Once the machine starts rolling, it's hard to step off." "No apology needed. This is your job, I get it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, rocking gently, the night sounds of the farm creating a peaceful backdrop. Finally, Charlotte spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "When I was little, before the singing competitions and record deals, this is what I wanted. A porch, some land, stars overhead, simple things." She took another sip of beer. Somewhere along the way, that dream got buried under platinum albums and world tours. Mason considered her words. "It's not too late, you know, for the porch and the stars." She turned to look at him, her expression wistful in the dim porch light. "Isn't it, though? I've been Charlotte James for so long, I'm not sure who I'd be without all that." "You'd be Kate," Mason said simply. "The woman who paints fences and laughs when she gets paint on her face. The woman who connects with strangers and remembers how they take their coffee." Charlotte's breath caught audibly. "You make it sound so easy." "Not easy," Mason corrected gently. "But possible. Most dreams need adjusting along the way, remember?" She smiled at hearing her own words repeated back to her. "Using my wisdom against me, Bradley?" "Learning from it," he countered, then hesitated before adding, "I've been thinking about what you said that first day about fame not leaving room for painting fences or watching sunsets. Maybe the answer isn't giving everything up, but carving out space for the simple things, alongside the complicated ones." Charlotte was quiet for so long that Mason wondered if he'd overstepped. Finally, she said, "I used to write psalms on porches like this, before teams of producers and focus groups got involved. Just me, a guitar, and whatever I was feeling." "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Every day," she admitted, then smiled ruefully. "Don't get me wrong, I'm grateful for everything I have. Most people would kill for my problems. But authenticity, that's harder to come by." An idea struck Mason. "Wait here," he said, disappearing into the house. He returned moments later with an old but well-maintained acoustic guitar his father's, kept more for sentimental value than use. Charlotte's eyes widened as he handed it to her. "Really?" No producers, no audience, just the stars and me, Mason said, settling back into his chair. If you want. She cradled the instrument carefully, running her fingers along the worn wood before positioning it in her lap. After a moment of hesitation, she began to play softly at first, then with growing confidence. The melody was unfamiliar to Mason, something new and unpolished, but hauntingly beautiful. When she began to sing, her voice was different from the powerful instrument showcased in arenas, more intimate, more raw. The lyrics spoke of fences and paintbrushes, of masked identities and unexpected connections, of finding authenticity in unlikely places. Mason sat transfixed, realizing he was witnessing something rare, and precious Charlotte James creating something purely for herself, unfiltered by commercial considerations. When the last notes faded into the night, silence enveloped them, too perfect to immediately break. That was, Mason finally said, searching for adequate words. Just a rough draft, Charlotte interjected, suddenly self-conscious. Something I've been playing with since meeting you. It's beautiful, he said simply. Different from your usual stuff, she smiled wryly. My producer would have a heart attack. Where's the hook, Charlotte? Where's the radio-friendly chorus? Her impression of a gruff male voice made Mason laugh. Will you play it tomorrow? At the concert? Charlotte strummed a thoughtful chord. I hadn't planned to. It's not finished, not polished. Maybe that's why you should, Mason suggested. Something real, straight from the source. She considered this, her fingers absently finding patterns on the strings. Maybe? It's terrifying, though, being that vulnerable in front of an audience. More terrifying than showing up unannounced to help a stranger paint his fence? That earned him a genuine laugh. Fair point. She set the guitar aside gently. Speaking of that fence, it looks like it's holding up well. Best-looking fence in the county, Mason confirmed. Though I might be biased about my painting partner. Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to charge with unspoken possibilities. Charlotte leaned forward slightly, her expression open and questioning. Mason closed the distance, his hand gently cupping her cheek, as their lips met in a kiss that felt both inevitable and surprising. It was Charlotte who finally pulled away, though she remained close enough that Mason could feel her breath on his face. I should go, she whispered. Early start tomorrow. Mason nodded, reluctantly releasing her. Tomorrow. She stood, hesitating before handing back the guitar. Keep it handy? I might need it again. Anytime, he promised, watching as she descended the porch steps and disappeared into the darkness, back to her world of tour buses and entourages. Mason remained on the porch long after she'd gone, replaying the evening in his mind. The beer in his hand grew warm, forgotten as he considered the impossible situation. A world-famous singer and a failing farmerette sounded like the setup to a bad country song. And yet, the day of the concert dawned clear and hot, a perfect summer Saturday. By noon, cars lined the county road leading to the Bradley farm, guided by local volunteers to designated parking areas. Food trucks and vendor booths had sprung up overnight, creating a festival atmosphere. The stage, modest by Charlotte's usual standards, but impressive for Cedar Creek, dominated the fallow field, sound equipment gleaming in the sunlight. Mason spent the morning helping wherever needed, directing parking, answering questions from curious visitors, ensuring the influx of people didn't disrupt his working fields. He'd barely caught a glimpse of Charlotte, who was sequestered with her band for final rehearsals. Vivian found him around 5 o'clock, as the crowd continued to grow. Charlotte's asking for you, she said without preamble. Backstage in 15 minutes? Jim will escort you. True to her word, the security guard appeared precisely on time, leading Mason through the maze of equipment and personnel behind the stage. Charlotte was in a small makeshift dressing room, really just a corner of a production tent screened off for privacy. She was mid-transformation from the casual woman he knew to Charlotte James, superstar, with a stylist adjusting her hair while she reviewed set notes. Her face lit up when she saw him. You came! You sent an armed escort, Mason pointed out dryly, nodding toward Jim. Charlotte laughed, dismissing the stylist with a grateful smile. When they were alone, she crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. "Nervous?" she asked. "Shouldn't I be asking you that?" She shrugged, the sequins on her stage outfit catching the light. "I've done this hundreds of times. You're the one with 1,000 strangers trampling your farm." "They're being surprisingly respectful," Mason assured her. "Frank's been giving impromptu tours of the working parts of the farm. I think he's enjoying the attention." Charlotte squeezed his hands. "There's something I need to ask you." The seriousness in her tone made Mason's heart skip. "Anything. I want you to join me on stage, for one song." Of all the requests he might have anticipated, this wasn't one of them. "Me? On stage? Charlotte, I can't sing or play, not to perform," she clarified quickly. "Just to be there. The song I played last night. I finished it this morning. It's called Faded Fences, and it's about you, us, this place. I want to debut it tonight, but I want you there when I do." Mason stared at her, momentarily speechless. The thought of standing before 1,000 people terrified him, but the pleading look in Charlotte's eyes made refusal impossible. "Just stand there? No singing?" he confirmed. Her relieved smile was answer enough. "Just stand there. Maybe bring the guitar, it feels right, somehow." Before Mason could respond, Vivian appeared at the doorway. "10 minutes, Charlotte. I'll do it," Mason told her, earning a radiant smile and a quick, fierce hug. "Thank you," she whispered against his ear. "For everything." The concert began at sunset, the stage lights creating a magical glow across the field. From his vantage point at the side of the stage, Mason watched in awe as Charlotte transformed completely into her public persona. Her voice soared across the crowd, her presence commanding absolute attention as she delivered hit after hit. Between songs, she spoke about the drought affecting local farmers, about community resilience, and the importance of supporting agriculture. The crowd responded enthusiastically, especially the local residents who had never expected a star of her magnitude to care about their struggles. 2/3 of the way through the set, Charlotte paused, her expression growing more intimate as the lights dimmed slightly. "I want to share something new with you tonight," she said, her voice carrying through the perfect acoustics. "Something I wrote right here, on this farm." A murmur of excitement rippled through the audience. "But I need some help with this one." That was his cue. Mason stepped forward, his father's guitar in hand, heart pounding so loudly he was certain the microphones would pick it up. Charlotte's face softened at the sight of him, her public persona slipping just slightly. "This is Mason Bradley," she told the crowd, who responded with curious applause. "This is his farm we're on tonight. And this song is about unexpected connections and finding authenticity in a world of faded fences." She nodded to her band, who began a gentle accompaniment as Mason handed her the guitar. Taking it, Charlotte briefly squeezed his hand before turning back to the microphone. The song unfolded just as it had the night before, but with the full support of her band adding depth to the melody. The lyrics painted vivid pictures: a white fence under a merciless sun, a woman in disguise seeking something real, a farmer whose quiet dignity revealed truths about authenticity and value. Mason stood beside her, initially frozen with stage fright, but gradually relaxing as he focused on Charlotte rather than a sea of faces before them. The crowd listened in rapt silence, sensing they were witnessing something uniquely genuine from an artist they thought they knew. As the final chorus approached, Charlotte turned toward Mason, singing directly to him rather than the audience. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable, a public acknowledgement of whatever was growing between them. When the song ended, the silence lasted a heartbeat before the crowd erupted in thunderous applause. Charlotte took Mason's hand and raised it with hers in a gesture of shared triumph, before he gratefully retreated from the stage, his part in the performance complete. The remainder of the concert passed in a blur, with Charlotte delivering her biggest hits to an increasingly enthusiastic crowd. For the encore, she returned to Faded Fences, explaining that some songs demanded to be heard twice. By the time the final notes faded and the crowd began dispersing, it was clear the event had been an unqualified success. Early estimates from the ticket sales and donations suggested they had raised well over the $40,000 Mason needed, enough to help several local farms weather the financial crisis. The cleanup crew would handle most of the breakdown the next day, but the essential equipment and Charlotte's team needed to pack up immediately for their morning departure to the next tour stop. Mason helped where he could, while keeping a respectful distance from the efficient routine of the road crew. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Charlotte finally escaped her postio obligations, finding Mason by the now empty stage. She had changed from her performance outfit into comfortable jeans and a t-shirt, her face scrubbed free of stage makeup, looking more like Kate again. "You were amazing," Mason said simply, handing her a bottle of water. She accepted it gratefully, taking a long drink before responding. "So were you. Bravest thing I've seen in a long time, getting up there like that." "Worth it," he assured her. "The song, it's going to be a hit, you know." Charlotte shrugged, unconcerned with commercial prospects for once. "Maybe. But it's already done what matters most," it told the truth. They stood in comfortable silence, gazing at the stars visible now that the stage lights had been extinguished. Finally, Charlotte spoke again, her voice tentative. "I have to leave in a few hours. The tour, 10 more cities before it wraps up." Mason nodded, the reality he'd been avoiding settling in his chest like a stone. "I know. But after that," she continued, "I've been thinking about what you said. About carving out space for simple things alongside the complicated ones." Hope flickered in Mason's chest. "Yeah?" Charlotte turned to face him fully. "I have a cabin in Colorado. Nothing fancy, just a place I bought years ago thinking I'd go there to write or relax. I spent maybe 2 weeks there in 5 years. Sounds peaceful," Mason offered, unsure where she was. "Going with this?" "It is. It's also remote, private, and has the most amazing view of the mountains." She took a deep breath. "I was thinking of spending more time there after the tour. Maybe you'd want to visit? See if we can figure out what this is between us, away from all this?" She gestured at the concert setup. The invitation hung in the air, weighted with implications. Mason considered it carefully, aware that their worlds remained fundamentally different despite their connection. "What about the farm?" he asked practically. Charlotte smiled. "That's the beauty of it. The Drought Relief Fund is setting up a management program for farms in transition. You could take a few weeks, even a couple of months, without losing everything you've worked for. Give yourself space to decide what you really want, long term." The thought was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. Leave the farm, even temporarily? Yet the alternative, watching Charlotte drive away tomorrow, back to her world of spotlights and screaming fans, possibly never to return, seemed far worse. "I've never seen mountains," Mason said finally. "Might be nice." Charlotte's smile was worth any uncertainty the future might hold. She stepped closer, fitting herself against him as naturally as if they'd been embracing for years, rather than days. Mason wrapped his arms around her, breathing in the scent of her hair, committing the moment to memory. "It won't be easy," she warned, her voice muffled against his chest. "My life is complicated, public. There will be gossip, speculation." "I'm not exactly social media material," Mason agreed dryly. Charlotte leaned back to look at him, her expression serious. "That's exactly why this matters. You see me, the real me. Not the image, not the brand. Just me." "Do you know how rare that is?" Mason brushed a strand of hair from her face, marveling at how this extraordinary woman had crashed into his ordinary life and changed everything. "I'm beginning to understand." The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when they finally parted, Charlotte to grab a few hours of sleep before departure, Mason to check on his animals before collapsing into his own bed. They made no dramatic declarations, no promises beyond Colorado after her tour. Yet as Mason watched her tour bus pull away later that morning, the newly painted fence gleaming in the background, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, not just for saving his farm, though that burden had been lifted, but for a future that suddenly contained possibilities he'd never dared imagine. 2 months later, as Mason stood on the porch of a rustic cabin nestled among towering pines, guitar in hand, and Charlotte's head resting on his shoulder, as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink, he thought about fences, how they could keep things out or hold things in, how they needed constant maintenance, how even the most damaged ones could be made beautiful again with patience and care. "What are you thinking about?" Charlotte asked, sensing his contemplative mood. Mason smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Just that some fences are worth painting, even when they seem beyond repair." Charlotte laughed softly, understanding the metaphor without explanation. "And some painters are worth letting into your life, even when they show up uninvited." The guitar rested comfortably in Mason's lap. He'd been learning, slowly but steadily, under Charlotte's patient tutelage, not to become a performer, but to create something authentic together, away from stages and spotlights. Here, in this in-between space they'd created. They were neither celebrity and farmer nor Charlotte and Mason, but simply two people discovering that sometimes the most unexpected connections are the ones worth fighting for, worth adjusting dreams for. As the last light faded from the sky, Charlotte began humming "Faded Fences," now climbing the charts. Despite her label's initial skepticism about its commercial appeal, Mason joined in, his deeper voice harmonizing with hers, creating something new and beautiful from their differences. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Charlotte had interviews scheduled, new songs to record, public appearances to navigate. Mason had decisions to make, about the farm, about his future, about balancing two worlds that seemed impossibly distant. But tonight, as stars appeared overhead and the mountain air grew crisp around them, none of that mattered. Tonight, they were just two people who had found each other against all odds, painting something beautiful together, one brushstroke at a time. "I'm glad I stopped that day," Charlotte whispered into the comfortable silence. "I'm glad I let you paint my fence," Mason replied, the simple truth containing all they needed to say. Some connections, they were learning, transcend all boundaries, even those between different worlds. And sometimes, the most unexpected meetings lead to the most meaningful journeys, from faded fences to mountain sunsets, from isolation to belonging, from masking who you are to revealing your truest self. In the end, that was the real miracle. Not that a country music superstar had painted a farmer's fence, but that two people had found the courage to set aside their masks and see each other clearly, authentically, completely. And in doing so, they discovered that perhaps they weren't from such different worlds after all.